And after the picture was taken, the tiger sprang at the camera, knocked over the camera. And when my grandparents went back the next morning, they found the camera on the ground, but luckily neither it was broken nor the glass plate negative was broken, and this was the result. So it's quite an amazing picture. It was described in the Illustrated London News, where it was published, as the most dramatic wild animal picture ever taken at the time. Tripwire for a tiger, because that camera trapping method in those days was called tripwire photography.
Hi everyone, welcome to UnWild India's first ever podcast. And our first guest is very special. Over a century ago, when most people entered jungles with the gun, one man carried a camera, helped change the future of tigers. F.W. Champion. Today, his grandson James Champion is with us.
Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here with you, Anup.
Thank you so much. Welcome to India.
Thank
Here in Pilibhit Tiger Reserve.
Yeah, it's my first visit to this area. I did go to Dudwa in the past, but I've never stopped in Pilibhit. Of course, we drove past it in the long distant past, but I've never had a chance to come here first before to actually really enjoy it.
And since we just came back from a safari in Pilibhit Tiger Reserve, we also talked about this. But for the listeners who may not know, maybe you can give us a short brief about your grandfather and, everything else.
Yeah, well, I want to come back to this Terai area of India because this is where my grandfather did most of his work. He came to India in 1913 and finally got a job as a forest officer in 1923. There was
the first forest officer in the imperial.
Yeah, well, he wasn't the first forest officer. There were many before him, but he was perhaps one of the most famous forest officers, mainly because he worked hard to campaign for the protection of wildlife at a time when his colleagues were busy shooting animals with guns rather than cameras. And also because he was the first person to ever take photographs of tigers in the wild. And his photos were quite famous in the 1920s and 30s. And he's still remembered in this area by wildlife enthusiasts. So it's always a great honor for me to come back and be looked after by people who are interested in that aspect of history. And I think my grandfather would be very pleased to be traveling back here through me.
So he was also referred as the father of track camera of power.
He was, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that system had been developed in America before, and there were two people called the Kirtans who'd already used that technique. But it was the first time that that technique had been used in India. And so what he would do is he would go out into the jungle during the day and he would find the pug marks of tigers along the track. And then together with my grandmother, who was not afraid of anything, they would go and set out the camera by the side of the track that they could see the pug marks on. It was a large camera like this size. We still have it in our house in Scotland today. I don't know if it works. And he would set it up on a small tripod and cover it with leaves and branches, obviously leaving the lens clear. And he would then attach a wire to the camera and place the wire across the path just above kind of ground level. And that would be attached to a flash, which he had to spoon the magnesium powder into. It was not like modern technology. And there was also a battery. And he would focus the camera lens on roughly where he thought the tiger space would be if it came in the direction he wanted it to come. But of course, he had no influence over that. So he actually got many photos on the backside of tigers and other animals. And he would then leave the area. Initially, he used to sit up in a tree all night waiting for the flash. But he got malaria, and my grandmother didn't like him sitting up in the trees all night. And actually, there was no point, because he would only take one photo per night. So the tiger would come along, if my grandfather was lucky, and it would touch the wire with its front paw, And in doing so, it would fire the flash and automatically fire the camera at the same time. The tiger would have a bit of a shock. The next morning, my grandparents would come back and pick up the camera and take it back to the forest rest house or wherever they were staying. And in a dark room, they had a portable dark room, they would develop the glass plate negative. And if they were lucky, then they would get remarkable shots. And of course, it was not just tigers. Any animal that came on that path would be photographed. And of course, sometimes the magnesium powder was wet or something would go wrong. So the number of successes was quite low. But when it was successful, the photographs were quite remarkable. They were published all over the English-speaking world. So my grandfather was well known as the father of Indian wildlife photography. He also took up filming. He got a Bell & Howell 60mm clockwork cine camera, which we also still have in our house in Scotland today. And he would take moving films. Of course, there was no sound. He started with black and white film, but he managed to get some Kodachrome color film before the Second World War. So some of those films which were made in the 1930s are in color. And then during the Second World War, the color film became unavailable again, so he had to go back to black and white film. But to look at his films, it really takes you back to a different era. Of course, they're quite shaky, and you can hear the whirring noise of the film going through, but still they're very evocative of a different era.
It must have been very difficult, because I read somewhere that, he could only click one photograph per night.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Because, of course, the camera had a glass plate negative in the back. Each glass plate negative was quite expensive. And so, only one shot could be taken because there was only one negative. These days, we can take multiple images or moving images. But in those days, you could only take one shot.
Only one shot.
Yeah.
And several times there would be other animals.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah, or a complete failure.
A complete failure.
Frequently, a complete failure.
Very patient.
He was very patient man. He'd taken up wildlife photography as a teenager in the UK. And he actually came to India with the ambition of being the first person to take photographs of tigers. But as I mentioned, he came to India in 1913, and he didn't achieve his ambition until 1923, 10 years later.
10 years later.
Yeah. But that was not because he failed. It's because the First World War came along, and he served on the northwest frontier in the army. And it was only in 1922 that he managed to come back to India and take up a position as a forester in this area.
I also see some of the photographs he took, a bear carrying two babies.
Yes.
Either looking directly into the camera.
Yes.
They're pretty sharp.
Images. Very sharp images. Even today, it would be hard to get sharper images. And somehow, those black and white images are almost more impressive than the color ones you can get today. Perhaps because the background doesn't interfere with the image of the animal. So they're really remarkable. Yeah.
Any specific pictures that you want to talk about? We'll show it on the screen.
Yes, well, there was one picture which I've actually got on the front cover of a book which I've recently published, which is actually a collection of his writings. Initially, I put together one in 2012, which I called Tripwire for a Tiger, because that camera trapping method in those days was called tripwire photography. And the book is actually an anthology of articles which he wrote and published in different magazines and journals around the world. And so they'd never been published in one volume before. So I thought it was a nice idea to collect as many of these articles as possible from different magazines and journals, and then put them together into one volume. So I published this first one in 2012, and it was about half the articles that I'd found. And it was quite successful, this book. And now, 11 or 12 years later, I've just published the second volume, which I launched at the Jaipur Literary Festival. So these two volumes together actually cover almost all the articles that he wrote. But to go back to your question about the photograph, I mean, this one was perhaps his most famous photo. On the front cover here, you can only see just the central part of the photo. But, of course, the actual format of the original photo was landscape and white art. Yeah. And my grandfather, even though this picture was his most famous, it was published on the front cover of the Illustrated London News and various other magazines. And it was seen as his best photograph. But he was very self-critical. And one of the things that he was particularly upset about was that you can just see here some bamboo leaves. Right. And on the original picture, you can see a lot more of that. But they're only half the arch. Right. And originally, there was supposed to have been a complete arch of bamboo. That's how he'd set it up. It was like a kind of studio. Right. But unfortunately, before the tiger came along, some wild elephants approached from the side and ate this half part of it. Yeah. And so when my grandfather developed this picture, he wasn't very satisfied because his lovely arch was only half there. He also didn't like this position on the front paw because he said it was blurred by movement. But he may have been self-critical, but everyone else thought this photograph isn't quite remarkable. And the other one you mentioned about a tiger that crouched down in front of the camera, I put on the front cover of the other book, and you can see here, the back of the tiger is kind of up. And this tiger had seen its own image, its own reflection in the lens. Yeah. And it crouched down and was obviously curious to know, why is another tiger just here? And after the picture was taken, the tiger sprang at the camera, knocked over the camera. And when my grandparents went back the next morning, they found the camera on the ground, but luckily neither it was broken nor the glass plate negative was broken. And this was the result. So it's quite an amazing picture. It was described in the Illustrated London News, where it was published, as the most dramatic wild animal picture ever taken at the time. Amazing. So it was really quite something, yeah. So anyway, I published these two books, and they are available on Flipkart, not Amazon, because my publisher doesn't like Amazon. So if anyone is interested, then they could buy them on Flipkart.
Absolutely, that's amazing, and thank you.
Yes, I've dedicated my bounty to me. We better make sure we get the right one. Yeah. I mean, I would give you this one as well, but unfortunately, this is the only copy I haven't been able to be on this journey.
That's why I can always take it from.
Yeah, that's right. It seems to be 9 rupees.
But it's one of them, for sure.
Yes, it's this one, yeah. Yeah, okay, thanks very much. It's my pleasure for me to give you that book.
It's your
message. There we are. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much. And also, I mean, at that time when the shooting tigers was very fashionable, and your grandfather chose to instead pick a camera, how unusual was that mindset in this time?
Extremely unusual. I don't think anyone had that kind of idea that shooting tigers or shooting other wildlife was in any way unacceptable. Because, of course, there were many of them in those days. In fact, I once asked my great uncle, who was my grandfather's elder brother. He was also a well-known forester in India, HG champion. But he loved hunting. And he said that there were so many of these animals in those days, nobody even thought that they could be endangered. But my grandfather and Jim Corbett realized that the numbers of tigers were going down very quickly. And not only tigers, but also lots of other animals were declining a lot. There was a huge amount of shooting going on. And my grandfather didn't like that. It's partly because he'd seen a lot of death and blood in the First World War. And he decided that he didn't like either violence against people or violence against animals. And because he had the opportunity to spend all day through his job, traveling through the jungles and so on, he was able to observe the behavior of animals. And he felt that studying the behavior of animals and taking photographs of them was far less destructive and far more positive than shooting the animal. And then even if you kept the trophy, if you kept the head or the skin, it was dead and its life could not continue. Whereas if you took a photograph of it, you knew that the animal was still there, still performing its daily functions and doing its thing. And it's far more rewarding to look at a photograph than it is to look at a dead trophy. So he felt like that. But it was really very difficult for him because most of his contemporaries, both in the forest department and also in the army, because of course he'd been in the army during the First World War, they thought it was like a direct threat to them to have someone who was suggesting that what they were doing was wrong. So he had to be careful about how he did his, or tried to put across his message. But if you read these articles in the books, you can actually see how gently he wrote about how wonderful it was to watch wildlife rather than kill it. And that was his main method of putting his message across.
And how, what was the process of counting tiger? Was there a documented?
Yeah, there was. Actually, my grandfather was the first person to actually suggest that it was possible to recognize individual tigers.
Not by paws.
Not by cut marks, but by the stripes. And, he saw that. I mean, here, for example, we can see two different tigers, and we can see that they have done passes on their heads.
Right.
These days, they often do it by the stripes on the side, but because when my grandfather was taking his photos, the photos really often showed the head and the front part of the body more so than the side part. So he recognized that you could see how many different stripes and in what pattern they were, and therefore you could identify which tiger was which. It's a very far-sighted kind of piece of unintended research, really. But it's used today. That's the camera trap technique.
Was there a number that was documented?
No, I don't know. I mean, he would have known how many tigers there were in each individual beat that he was directing, because that's his job. He was a divisional forest officer and also conservator of forests and so on during his career. So he was out in the forest a lot of the time, and he was able to document roughly, how many tigers were in each area, right? Just really by looking at its photos.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was really great. One of the things he had to do as a forest officer was to issue permits
to hunt,
to shoot the tigers, and he hated that. Especially if it was in an area where he got to know the tigers and taken their photos. Yeah. And there were one or two occasions when apparently he issued permits to hunters for areas like the areas. Yeah.
And there was a story, you met someone.
I did.
He misguided.
I did, absolutely. Yes. I went to visit Billy Arjun Singh, who was one of the most famous tiger wallers. I visited him in 2006 at his home next to the Dudhwa National Park, Tiger Haven.
Beautiful home.
Marvelous home, yeah. And I had a lovely morning chatting with him. Billy Arjun Singh knew my grandfather, and he told me that my grandfather was his greatest hero. That was really something very special. But he said, you must come back this afternoon at around 5 o'clock, because another chap who knew your grandfather is arriving this afternoon, and I'm sure he'd love to meet you. So I was in Dudhwa, and I went off with Solu, my friend who always takes me around when I'm in Dudhwa. And then we came back in the afternoon, and Billy showed me in, and this man, who was 92 years old, a Britisher who'd stayed on in India after independence, was introduced to me. His name was John Wakefield. He had a kind of nickname of Papa John. And he was a kind of brand ambassador for Nagarfole National Park in South India. And that day, he'd just arrived, having driven all the way to Dudhwa from Nagarfole in a jeep by himself. He'd taken a week to do that.
And he was still 92.
92. Well, I can tell you, he looked more like about 70. He looked pretty healthy and pretty. Anyway, we sat down and we had tea. And John Wakefield, he kind of winked at me. He used to run a shikar company, so he was like a safari hunter. And he used to organize hunts for wealthy people. And he had to apply for permits. And he said to me, now, young champion, I have a bone to pick with you. And I didn't know what he was talking about. And then he said, now I know your grandfather used to issue permits to me for areas where he knew there were no tigers. And he looked quite angry. And then I didn't know what he was going to say next. And then he said, but I won't hold it against you. And he stood up and gave me a big hug. I think he's rather lovely. Yeah. So that was a lovely afternoon, I can tell you, sharing those memories with Billy and with John.
Papa John.
Amazing. Yeah.
And how was your grandfather able to convince Jim Corbett, and he ended up building your grandfather for
Yeah, exactly.
first national park?
I know, that's right. I don't know the history exactly of how that happened. Jim Corbett was about 20 years older than my grandfather, but they obviously came into contact with each other quite a lot through forestry, through FW being in charge of areas perhaps where Jim Corbett was doing some hunting, all this kind of stuff. Anyway, somehow, and I don't know how, they got invited onto the steering committee for the founding of India's first national park. My grandfather had already written an article saying how important he thought it would be for India to have its first national park. And so they were invited, I assume, by Sir Malcolm Haley, who was the governor of the United Provinces at that time. And Sir Malcolm Haley also felt that it was very important to have a national park. So Jim Corbett, my grandfather, and a number of other people were invited to come onto this steering committee, and they served together in drafting, I guess, the boundaries of the national park and also what should be allowed or what shouldn't be allowed in the newly designated national park. It was eventually designated in 1936, and it was initially called the Haley National Park after Sir Malcolm Haley. And I was told just very recently a little story that I'd never heard before. I was told by Rajiv Bhattari, who was a later director of the Corbett National Park. He said, did you realize that your grandfather actually shot himself in the foot by designating that area? Because one of the rules is that flashlight photography was not allowed in the new national park. But that was one of my grandfather's favorite flashlight photography areas. So I'm not sure how he got around that. I don't know whether the rules were very strictly enforced. But he did do a lot of photography also at Chilla, in what is now the Rajaji Mahal, and also at Dudwa. So maybe he could still carry on his flashlight photography in those two areas, but not in the core area of the Haley National Park. So I don't know exactly how that worked out, but anyway, it's something rather special to know that he was one of the architects of India's first national park.
So you also been retracing your grandfather's footsteps in India. What was that motivated you to do that?
I think it was because I grew up in Scotland in the old family home that my grandfather had lived in before me, and all of his photographs were there framed on the walls. And that really kind of inspired me. I knew about all the names of all the locations where he was in India. I found diaries. I found his butterfly collections. So I felt like I'd already known this area just by following, all these documents and photos that I saw in the old family home. And so that really inspired me.
And you still preserve those?
Yeah, we preserved all of that stuff, yes.
And still in intact condition?
Yes, still in remarkable condition, yeah. I first came to India in 1988 with my parents. My dad had been born in India and spent the first 8 years of his life traveling through the jungles with my grandparents. But then he was sent back to the UK and didn't see them again for a very long time. So for my father, it was a very difficult, emotional thing because he felt kind of rejected by his parents. And also, I think this whole link with India was a difficult thing because he'd loved his childhood here so much. And then he had no ability to come back here. And so we brought him here. My mum and I brought him here in 1988, just after he'd retired from his work. Yeah, it was a very emotional thing. Wonderful.
Yeah, I know you have to go.
Yeah, I'm afraid we do, because we're off to Dulwa. Absolutely. Follow in my grandmother's footsteps.
And you have a new safari coming up in the office.
Yes, we have a safari coming up.
So I'll not shut you out for a long enough time. So, maybe you just, you've been from, you're coming from Ramnagar.
Yes.
So you've seen the Bhavar area,
Yes.
landscape.
Yes.
Now you see